In this video, we're going to look at an unpublicised interview of Dr. Dewi Evans with BBC Radio Cymru, which occurred on Sunday the 1st of October 2023. So it was Debbie Kennett that first alerted me to this interview, and then between myself and Jabe, we've managed to extract this interview and translate it into English. So given that this went out at 6 o'clock on a Sunday evening on BBC Radio Cymru in Welsh, I guess the title is not strictly accurate in saying that it's an unheard interview, but this has had a very small audience, and I've never seen any reference to this interview previously, so I was quite keen to get it translated, which I managed to do. So I'm going to go over this interview in this video and analyse what Dr. Evans had to say. So before we begin, I'll firstly say that the interviewer Betty George, I'm not being harsh on her, but it probably doesn't come as a huge surprise that she gives a very soft interview, which is fair enough, I suppose, given that she's presenting a very small programme on a very small radio station in Wales for a very specialist audience. But it's not the most challenging interview, but nevertheless, we do hear a few interesting things from Dr. Evans that I'm going to go over in this video, painful though that will be. So Betty George begins by saying, "A very warm welcome to you. We're going to hear some quite terrifying things today that arose in a recent court case lasting months. The guest is a paediatrician who spent his career as the childcare consultant in Swansea. Then he moved into the legal field, giving evidence in court cases involving children. In the 10 years since he began in that field, he has given evidence in courts across Britain and in Ireland." Then he says, "but there is no doubt about that," which I doubt is a correct translation. "The Lucy Letby case, where she was given a life sentence for murdering and attempting to kill the small babies." Also, I think there is, "but there is no doubt about that. There's no doubt that the Lucy Letby case, where she was given a life sentence for murdering and attempting to kill the small babies in her care at a hospital in Chester, is the most challenging one he has dealt with to date. He was one of the main witnesses for the prosecution. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Dewi Evans." "Thank you very much, Bethan. Well, I'm starting to get used to giving interviews every now and then, especially in Welsh, but also my English is pretty good on top of that." Now, I don't want to give him too much of a hammering for this, but everyone in Wales speaks English. So, as far as I'm aware, there'd be virtually no one that exclusively speaks Welsh, and I think only 25% of the population speak Welsh. So, pretend my English is pretty good. I mean, you have to speak in English all the time. So, anyway. And I believe the media have done well in the cases. They've been very sensitive about the whole thing. Yeah, very, very sensitive. Yeah. Betty George, "It was terrifying to tell the truth. Yes, you were in court giving evidence. How many times? How long were you there?" "I gave evidence 15 times over a period of 22 weeks. I was in court. The barrister wanted me to be there to hear the evidence and the other witnesses. So I was there from the 2nd week to the 24th week, and I was very happy to leave Manchester around Easter. Yes, exhausting no doubt, I would think. I was very exhausted indeed. I thought that sitting and listening would be something easy to do, but you had to concentrate the whole time. And of course, a lot of the information I heard came from parents' notes and the notes of nurses and local doctors. I was hearing it for the first time. The information was not with me. Those reports weren't coming from anyone that I had. It wasn't with me when I prepared the first reports, which was in 2017. So we'll stop there and just reflect on the fact that Dr. Evans is making this statement again, that he heard information in court that he hadn't heard before. Despite the fact that it's taken him 5 years to get to this point, he's still encountering new information that he hadn't taken into consideration in his multiple reports across half a decade. Now, we know for a fact that he altered things during the court case based on that information, and he also has altered things after the court case based on that information, although for some reason he attempts to deny this. I don't know why, because we've got documented evidence that he's done it. I'm not privy to absolutely everything that occurred in court, and I'm making this assertion as a non-scientist and a non-medic, but for me it would be extremely strange, having done reports that extended over a duration of 5 years, to then start amending them in court based on information that you heard during the court process. That would seem to me to be very unscientific and frankly unacceptable. And it seems to me the only reason to do it is that he knew the information that he heard in court made the opinions that he'd previously expressed incorrect. And there are several instances of this in court where incidents that were suddenly on one day were moved to another day when it was no longer convenient because Lucy Letby wasn't on duty. Lucy Letby wasn't around for the collapse. So then it would have to be another nurse that caused the collapse. So then you've got two serial killers running around, so that obviously couldn't work. So I would immediately view it as a red flag that this gentleman is changing things in court based on what he's heard. And he's mentioned this several times. This is not... He can't say otherwise, really, because it's in the transcripts, and now we've got a lot of the transcripts. But he was perfectly willing to say to interviewers before this really occurred that, oh yeah, I heard a lot of new information that I hadn't encountered before during my 5 years of doing the reports. But none of it changed the fact Lucy Letby was guilty. Whatever I did, I looked at numerous things, I changed things around, sometimes I completely changed the method of collapse or death, I changed things in court, I changed things before court, I changed things after court, but whatever happened, I still concluded that Lucy Letby was solely guilty for everything that occurred. That's really the worrying thing about the whole escapade, in my view. So moving on. Betty George says, so this case has been sitting on your shoulders for 8 years now. The reports, that must have taken a long time. You had to be thorough, of course. Dewi Evans, it had to be detailed. You don't get all the information, of course, from just the reports alone. And 1 week to the case was that I was unable for some reason to go and see the ward myself. That would have been quite helpful for me to see what kind of resources were on the ward, what support, where everything was, how many nurses were taking care of different rooms, of course, things like that. So I had to go in and work off the plans bit by bit and then piece together the notes. And of course the notes do not include everything. So I had to keep adding to each report, and in one case I prepared one report plus 8 additional small supplementary reports as more evidence came in. So we've heard this claim before that he couldn't go on the ward. I have no reason to disbelieve that. He's also said previously that he wasn't able to speak with people that worked at the hospital. Now, I can't see any conceivable reason why you wouldn't be allowed to do that, and that should be a critical part of the process. But it's very difficult, I think, for anyone that's compiled this type of report before. I'm sure that they will agree that the timescale involved in compiling these reports is insane, and it can't possibly be justified. If there was clear evidence of malfeasance, and if there was clear evidence of malignant behaviour, that should become clear very quickly. So on the one hand, as Dr. Evans references later in this interview, you have him saying, well, I knew immediately that there was deliberate harm. I knew within 10 minutes. And then on the other hand, you have him taking 5 years to piece these things together. And then at the end of it, the final reports and the final science is still total crap anyway. So that, I think, generally speaking, should be considered a disturbing picture about what occurred. And then even on top of that, he still admits, well, I didn't actually go to the ward, I didn't actually speak to anyone from the hospital, this is just me looking through academic papers and going, oh yeah, that one probably fits, we'll put that in the court case, which we know is exactly what he did with Lee and Tanswell. And it's just fortunate, really, that Dr. Lee has heard about this and said, well, no, actually, you've completely misused that. And generally speaking, I've said this in previous videos, but I must emphasise this again. It's not proper science to just look through academic papers until you find one that you can cite and then say, oh look, this explains everything that occurs in the court case, which is literally exactly what he did. Because although he's claimed to have used 18 papers, we know for a fact that none of them are diagnostic. This is included in the Court of Appeal document. I've gone over this in previous videos. So this whole process is, let's just say, it's dubious. That's the most generous way you can describe it, is to say that it's dubious. It should have been handled completely differently, and I would say that a more professional medic or a more professional witness would have done things completely differently. So moving on to what Betty George says next. So why wouldn't you just go and see the ward and take in as much of the circumstances as possible? That's something I think to discuss in future because it's something I could do. I think one important thing was this. When I got the reports, so this is a very important point again. When I got the reports, I didn't know the name Lucy Letby or anything, but I looked at all the cases in our neonatal unit. And so what I did was look at every child who had died or who had a code blue event, this means an emergency event, And then I told the police, you have to find out who the nurses were on shift at those times. I'll continue for the next paragraph. And in fact, even after the first 4, only one nurse was involved in each of those cases and duty for each of them. And of course, only one nurse was there for all the cases, namely Lucy Letby. Every other nurse, as you would expect, would have been on duty for 4, 5 or 6 cases, but the pattern was very strange. And of course, while that by itself doesn't prove that anyone was responsible, it did show that she was there, and in several of those cases, of course, she was the only person present. So this is a critical part of the interview, so we need to reflect on this quite seriously. So firstly, let's look at this statement. I think one important thing was this. When I got the reports, I didn't know the name Lucy Letby or anything, but I looked at all the cases in our neonatal unit. So firstly, this seems to me to be a very strange statement in that he's so keen to emphasise that he didn't know the name Lucy Letby. Like, he hasn't been prompted, he hasn't been asked a question about this. This isn't the most important thing about this case. And if an entirely dispassionate and professional inquiry had taken place, it wouldn't be necessary to say this. So immediately the fact that he's saying, oh, I never saw the name Lucy Letby, that's immediately a red flag, even before we look at anything else at all. But the second thing is, Lucy Letby was named in 2018, so this was footage of the time of the police going through the absolutely pointless escapade of searching a house that they only did to get the case in the media, because they're complete shitbags. And this is Lucy at the time reporting to Cheshire Police. This was, I think, a little bit later after her arrest. But we knew literally what she looked like. We knew her name. We'd seen her in the police station. We knew where she lived. We know they searched the garden. This is 4 years before the case goes to court. So in all the intervening period, while Dr. Dewi Evans is continually refining his reports, he knows the name Lucy Letby. That's undeniable. And he even made alterations to his opinion, his so-called medical opinion, while she was sitting in the dock opposite him in court. So for him to say, hey, when I first started the reports, I never even heard the name Lucy Letby, even that is doubtful, but that's really of no relevance, because your final reports that you submitted many years after the name Lucy Letby came into the public domain, you definitely did know the name Lucy Letby. But that's not everything that you need to know about this issue, because you also need to look at this meeting that occurred between Nigel Wenham of the Cheshire Constabulary and senior clinicians on the 15th of May 2017. This is Thirlwell document INQ 0102309. Now, it probably won't come as an enormous surprise to people watching this video that the 2 senior clinicians were Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam. So let's look at what occurred in this meeting. So what happened is Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam met with Paul Hughes and Nigel Wenham. Dr. Susie Holt was present, apparently, but when you read through the document, she didn't say anything. I don't really know why she was there. But she doesn't even work at the Council of Chester, so I don't particularly understand why she was present in the meeting, but she didn't say anything of any consequence. Now, I'm not going to go over this whole document because we'll probably do that in future videos, and I can't go into everything related to this at this point in time. But what I can tell you is that this is 3 days after, as we've shown in other videos, the police were saying demonstrably, explicitly, there's no evidence, we have no intention of investigating this whatsoever. Then Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam walk into the police station and everything changes. And I'm just going to show you one thing from this document, and one thing only. So they said, nurse, 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 that's nursery to be fair, nurse, 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 designated nurse, the nurse, nurse, nurses, nurse, nurse, you get the general idea. Now, you could look at some of the specific statements. For example, there's one here, they talk about Lucy being put on day shift, so they've identified her very clearly. They would try to claim that they didn't identify her, but they did actually identify her. There's even a point where it seems like they say her name, but that could just be a badly written document, so I can't confirm that completely. But in this document, firstly, they talk exclusively about their concerns about a nurse, about a specific nurse, and then also they basically identify Lucy as well. And And they're saying here, at the point of the collapse, the nurse was present at that time in close proximity. This has not happened to other staff. So they're already passing on their concerns and their suspicions. And, they're saying, the named nurse was around here again. And then later on, the nurse was on duty, the nurse was present, all of these things. The nurse, this is a critical comment, we are not on a witch hunt. We have concerns that this nurse was present in far too many occasions. So then, this was just passed into the police investigation. So we have here, initially, Dr. Evans claiming that, I never knew anything about Lucy Letby. I couldn't possibly know that a nurse had been suspected, but we know that this meeting between Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam on the 15th of May, this is absolutely instrumental in an investigation taking place, and all they did was go in there and say, we think it's a nurse's fault, we think it's a nurse's fault, this nurse was around too much, which moved her from day shifts to night shifts. They basically identified her, and also they clearly fingered her. So the police knew in May 2017 that a nurse was suspected. From this point on, they not only did they never place any of the consultants under suspicion, but they just assumed the consultants couldn't possibly have done anything wrong, which we've seen with Dr. Evans. He has made exactly the same assumption. So for him to claim, as he claimed initially, I never even considered that Lucy Letby could have been involved, he knew damn well it would be extraordinary if the police never mentioned this to him at any stage. In the intervening year between Lucy Letby being definitively named because she was arrested and Dr. Evans beginning his so-called investigation. So that's the first thing. It would be incredible if he didn't know that they suspected a specific nurse. That would be the first thing. Secondly, I would suspect that it's very likely that he did hear the name Lucy Letby at some point during that intervening period. So that's the first thing to say about this statement. Okay, so the next statement we'll move on to is this. And so what I did was look at every child who had died or who had a code blue event, and I then told the police, you have to find out who the nurses were on shift at those times. And in fact, even after the first 4, only one nurse was involved in each of those cases and duty for each of them. So here he makes this statement about after the first 4 that we'll return to in a second. But he says here, you have to find out who the nurses were on shift at those times. So previously, Dr. Evans had said this. I then told police that if you harm a baby, it will deteriorate there and then, not the following day. So I also identified a time and date where each had probably been harmed and told them they needed to find out who was on duty. If they found the same person was there during lots of incidents, they'd have a suspect. So what is significant about this is this doesn't even require someone to be on duty all the time. And as was eventually cited in the court case, well, what Dr. Evans is saying here is, if someone's just around a lot of the time, they're probably the suspect. So that's problematical. And then he gives a slightly different version of events in this new interview. So in the original shift chart, I'm using the version from Unheard here, which demonstrates that Lucy virtually isn't on duty for half of these so-called collapses and so-called incidents. But in the original shift chart that was shown to the court, she's supposed to be there all the time. Dr. Evans is saying in this previous statement, it doesn't even matter if she's there all the time. She just needs to be there for lots of incidents. The other thing to note is he makes this comment about, other nurses are only there for a certain number of shifts, but they're all part-time. They're all bank staff. There are various reasons for that. We've discussed all these things with Professor Richard Gill previously. So the other thing he has done is previously diminish the important statistics in the court case. So this is despite the fact that we've now seen that he made a statistical argument, and very early on, that the best way to work out who the suspect is just to look at, So he says here at this time, this was a while ago, I really am quite annoyed with statisticians. I think they've not been very professional. Why? They've not been very professional to question what you're doing. In what way have they not been very professional? It never crossed my mind, or the police's, or the prosecution's, or anybody's, the statistics were relevant. Why did the police commission Dr. Jane Hutton then? It never crossed their mind the statistics were relevant, but they contacted a statistician, then the Crown Prosecution Service told them not to go ahead. So it seems to me it probably did cross their mind. That seems to be a reasonable conclusion. The chart was used simply to show Letby was present at the scene of the crime. So this is all kind of redundant arguments that he's made previously, but I just want to point out this paragraph. They say the chart only showed those cases where she was present. What about the deaths that were not part of the trial? Well, if you did that, it wouldn't help the prosecution or the defence, because for the other deaths, she was actually present for most of them when the baby died. So this tells us two critical things. Firstly, it doesn't, most of them, the whole point is she's supposed to be there all the time, but that's not the most important thing. By far the most important thing about this statement is that Dr. Evans states that for these other cases, that Lucy Letby was actually present for most of them. So if we rewind back to the start of this interview, at the start of this interview, he's keen to emphasise, I never saw Lucy Letby's name anywhere. I never knew anything about Lucy Letby. But now he's saying, I know for a fact Lucy Letby was present for all the other deaths. Now, that's a pretty alarming contradiction, wouldn't you agree? Now, with regard to statistics not being important in the case, I just wanted to point this out because I was reading through this the other day. So this is the very first day of the trial. And this is literally the beginning comments from the prosecution. The morning was taken up with the judge giving a lot of instructions. So at 12:49 p.m, the prosecution begins the opening. And the first thing they say at 12:51 p.m. is just some stuff about the city of Chester and it having a busy general hospital that is a hospital like so many others in the UK. And then at 12:52 p.m, literally the second thing the prosecution says in court, after the first thing, which is basically nothing to do with the court case, is the statistics of the mortality rate were comparable prior to January 2015, but there was a significant rise in the number of babies dying or having catastrophic collapses. This rise was noticed, and the concern was the babies had died unexpectedly, and when babies collapsed, they did not respond to sufficient resuscitation. The collapse defied the expectations of the treating doctors. So this just shows you that the entire prosecution case is founded in this statistical anomaly. That is literally the basis for it. And they carried that on all the way through the court case, passing it from one inference to another. When they didn't have sufficient evidence for something, they just said, hey, it has to be Lucy. Lucy was always on duty. So they used the statistical spike in court, and they used what I've described as the it's always Lucy theory. And that was central to the prosecution case. And this is why the police commissioned Professor Jane Hutton. But the Crown Prosecution Service said, don't contact them. And Professor Richard Gill, when I interviewed him, has mentioned the reason why this occurred. He was in a meeting and he was essentially told, we don't think the jury can understand statistics. But then they just introduced bad statistics anyway. And so the last thing I want to mention is that Dr. Evans states that even after the first 4, only one nurse was involved in each of those cases and duty for each of them. And that's really significant because already after just 4 collapses or 4 incidents, they're looking at a statistical likelihood that they can just pin it on one nurse, which is exactly what they did. After, as we've discussed earlier in the video, Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam walks in there and says, it's a nurse, it's a nurse, it's a nurse over and over again, and basically identify that the nurse is Lucy Letby. So that was already occurring at that point in time. And then what's occurred after that is, we know for a fact Lucy Letby has been arrested, Lucy Letby has been named in the press, and then Dr. Evans has spent 4 years piecing his way through the other cases, trying to find collapses. And then, according to his own words that I've just quoted, he was aware that Lucy Letby's on duty for cases that he ruled out the court case, according to him. This just seems like some sort of defence that he's pulled out of the ether off the top of his head. But his own words indicate that he was aware of the presence of Lucy Letby, despite the fact that he'd begun the start of this radio interview by saying, by the way, I never knew anything about Lucy Letby. I never knew Lucy Letby was involved. But he's obviously now, yet again, in this litany of contradictions that he has now liberally tossed all over the media. This is just yet another contradiction. So we know for a fact that he knew damn well Lucy Letby was involved in this case. He knew damn well that Lucy Letby was on duty, etc., etc. We know that because he's told us that. So returning to the interview, Evans then says, and most of the incidents happened in the middle of the night at 2 a.m, 3 a.m. And then the interviewer says, well, there weren't enough staff on duty that time unless you have an emergency. And of course, she only had a few people present, and the other 3 nurses, of course, would be looking after the other babies. Evans, so the opportunity was very easy in the middle of the night, and that's what was happening. So I have got some research related to this in my book, but I'm not going to go over that at the moment. What I will mention is that they also allege that incidents followed her from nighttime to daytime. That's another contention of the prosecution. So it's really easy for her at night, but then suddenly it's her fault in the day as well. So that's all I will say about that. I won't go into the specific details in too much depth. Betty George, how did this come about? Did you approach the police to offer your expertise, or how do these things happen? So the National Crime Agency was established in 2013, and I found out that they were doing reports of this kind at that time. By 2017, I had made several dozen reports to police across England, 1 or 2 in Wales, I believe, where the NCA was connecting with the local police and saying, well, get in touch with the paediatrician down in Caerphilly. So with this case, I was in contact with the NCA about a completely different case. I said to them, by the way, that I had heard there were suspicions regarding the deaths of babies in the neonatal ward in Chester. They told me it was something of interest to them, so then the NCA got in touch with the police in Chester. They rang me and I began to realise what was going on. The word had got around about me, so I went out from Caerphilly in July 2017 and asked the police to bring me 1 of 2 of the baby notes so I could get some idea. From the start, as I looked through the notes, I saw that something was off. There were things in there that were not normal for someone working on a neonatal unit for decades. So I'll just mention this is a repetition of the statement he's made previously, that I immediately knew that there was inflicted harm within 10 minutes after walking into the police station. So here he sort of says, oh, it's when I was looking at the baby notes. It's basically saying exactly the same thing. The rest of it, we've heard these comments about the National Crime Agency before. I don't think there's any point in re-examining that. He obviously insists they'd contacted him in relation to another case. We can't prove otherwise, so we don't really know how that happened, how he got to hear about the case, etc., etc. It's not something that's provable, so I don't believe there's a lot of point in investing a lot of effort in that. It's been stated that perhaps the way he was introduced into the case was inappropriate. That might be the case, but I don't think there's any mileage in that, because the fact is he was introduced into the case. He is a legitimate expert witness, and he was put in the court case, even though he shouldn't have been. So when I say legitimate expert witness, he was a legitimate expert witness in that he was affiliated with the National Crime Agency. From any kind of reasonable or rational assessment, he should not have been in this court case. But I think there's very little mileage in looking at how the National Crime Agency were involved, how they recruited him, how he got involved with the police, etc., etc. The fact is the police decided he was an expert, and they allowed him to come into the case. Yes, I know there was this paediatricians meeting. I know various allegations have been made. We can't prove any of those allegations, unfortunately, so we just have to really leave it as far as I'm concerned. While it is important to mention the circumstances surrounding the National Crime Agency, but I don't think we can make too much of that, because he's given an explanation for it. We can't disprove that explanation, whether it's likely or unlikely, and we can't prove how we first heard about the case. We can't stop him being introduced into the case because it's in the past. We just have to accept that. So he says here, there was something odd in there. So right from the beginning, something was suspicious. I was looking at notes from January 2015 to June 2016, and it was clear that 15 of those notes were suspicious in terms of why the baby had died or why the baby had a code blue event. In addition, I had 2 other cases, namely the 2 cases where the babies had been given insulin. So that's an important point to note. So elsewhere, it has been stated that Dr. Stephen Breary identified the insulin cases. In the Court of Appeal document, and here, Dr. Evans is claiming that he identified the insulin cases. Again, I can't go into that into too much depth for various reasons, but this is well established and documented. So of the original 34 cases, there were now 17 babies where there was doubt, and of course many of the babies had been harmed more than once, and a number of the babies had been harmed in more than one way, so it was quite horrifying. And of course she ended up being convicted of murdering 7 and attempting to murder 7 others. The jury was undecided of 4 of the 10 where she'd been accused of attempted murder, and there is now discussion about whether those should have a retrial. It was an incredible case for the jury. They had to discuss technical issues. Many of them, I'm sure, had never heard some of those terms before. They had a colossal task. They did very well, truly. It was 8 women and 4 men, and they were firing questions at the judge from time to time. So probably just to correct something there, one person dropped out of the jury, of course. So that's not correct. It was clear from the questions they were asking that they understood what the message was to the prosecution. They were already discussing the matter, as you would expect, because you had 2 years of cases to deal with. So I don't think there's too much to discuss there. I'm sure that a neonatologist would say that this allegation about a number of babies have been harmed in more than one way is highly dubious. Of course, we've looked at those cases. Essentially, the milk case, Child E and Child O, where there are allegations that Lucy's used a device to somehow cause an internal bleed in the infant. So it's really, and the milk cases are particularly ridiculous. But I don't want to dwell on this too much because we all know that the scientific evidence that put in this case was extremely weak. There's no point going over that again. Obviously, he's making the same claims that we've heard from him in the past, so I don't think there's too much point in dwelling on that. And then Betty George says, "What about music, I say?" I will go over these incidental parts because there's a bit at the end. The latter parts of the interview are not really related to Lucy Letby, but I want to go over them because I think it illustrates something quite interesting about Dr. Evans, and I do want to demonstrate this to viewers. So anyway, he says, "It's nice to have music. I don't have music playing in the background, but it's nice. It's so easy these days to have a bunch of songs on the phone or an iPad and then have that through to get beautiful sound in the house. So that's nice. You've chosen first the school song and Dewi Evans. That is a good song. Well, first of all, I think we have to recognise Dewi Evans' contribution to the Welsh-speaking society over 30 years. And of course, he has 4 grandchildren live in this part of Wales, not Welsh-speaking areas by language. 2 of them go to the Welsh school in Barry and the other 2 to the Welsh school in Newport. Now, of course, when I was a child, when I was at college in Cardiff, there was, I think, 1 Welsh school in Cardiff at the time. There are 18 now. And now, wherever you live in Wales, if you want a Welsh education for your children, it's available. And I believe we must all recognise the contribution of the Language Society, the protests through the 60s, 70s and afterwards to gain rights for the language. And this song reflects the experience of one person's school life compared to the experience I would have had in Welsh schools in the years to come. Can Ear Ysgol by Dewi Evans. One day, I won't be sat here reading words that I've never encountered before about things that I don't understand in languages that I don't speak. I'm looking forward to that day. But for the years to come, I'll still be doing this. Hopefully, we can get Lucy out relatively quickly. So the reason I'm reading this out is that he's going to go on to discuss Welsh nationalism, or Welsh patriotism as he describes it, later in this interview, and that is quite significant. It's not related to Lucy's case, but I think it gives us an interesting insight into what Dewi Evans is like as a person. So then Betty George goes on to say, "Why did you choose this song, Are You a Great Patriot? It definitely brings several images to mind. Cymru am Byth, of course, the Welsh nationalist song of Wales, and words from Lewis Valentine resonate with us, and of course it's lovely to hear voices from the west of Wales. Tenors singing is lovely to hear, and Gwydion was singing first, wasn't he?" Now, it seems to suggest that Dewi Evans was actually singing at some point. Now, I have been spared that because I haven't listened to the recording, thankfully. And I'm going to spare you that, but he sings something here in Welsh that I will not attempt to pronounce because I haven't got a clue how to pronounce anything in Welsh, really. But it means, "For Wales, our country, O father of summer, white mantle, defend firmly, keep faithful and life to the just." Today's company choice is the paediatrician and patriot Dr. Dewi Evans. He was one of the main witnesses for the prosecution in the Lucy Letby case. So you retired as a consultant at Singleton Hospital quite young to work in the legal field afterwards, right? No, the legal field had been part of my life for 20 years when I was working in Swansea. And then a little after that, I got a phone call from a fellow GP, Dr. Bryn Gibbons, a man from Ireland, saying there was a case in Ireland involving a baby who was born and suffered severe damage due to clinical negligence, and they needed the opinion of a specialist doctor in Ireland. And I decided, well, this sounds interesting to me. I was in court back and forth over an extended period. The case was won in the end, and I got a taste for giving evidence. I should say at this point that we do return to the Lucy Letby case imminently. Betty George, so you were representing in the service it was very hard to prove. And at the time, of course, you didn't get evidence from the other side before you went into court, so you had no idea what the barrister would ask you about. And to tell the truth, I think the barrister didn't really understand at the start what the case was really about, because it was the first case in Ireland where a case was won against a hospital for clinical negligence. So it was quite a step, to tell the truth. After we won it, there was an appeal, a second trial, but everything was upheld and it was decided that the family would get the money to look after the little child. So this is a significant bit. How do you stand up to the barrister who's cross-examining you? In this case, the one defending Lucy Letby used a case from the past. The judge had called your report worthless and not balanced. How do you respond when a barrister accuses you of being worthless? So one wouldn't expect Betty George to give Dr. Dewi Evans a difficult interview, and she really softens this point by suggesting that it was the barrister that was accusing Dr. Evans of being worthless, which of course it wasn't. The barrister was just citing a report that had been made by a judge, Lord Justice Jackson, who'd written to the trial judge, Lord James Goss. So it wasn't really the barrister that was accusing, Ben Mize in this case, that was accusing Dr. Evans of being worthless. It was the barrister who was saying, look, I have this report, this letter from a judge who says that Dr. Evans was not only worthless, but that he was incapable of giving a balanced and impartial opinion, which is deeply ironic considering the point we're going to come on to in just a few moments. So then Dewi Evans says, that's how they are, referring to barristers. A few months later, you'll be in another case and they'll be your best friend, which is a fair comment. A barrister is a hunter. Betty George, did you feel fully confident when facing them? Oh, I did. You have to. I've got a fairly good idea of what the questions are going to be. You have to be clear and straightforward. You have to tell them, as I know, I'm the expert, not them. Poor souls, most of them have no medical or practical background. No, I haven't really had much trouble, with the barristers. And if you're having trouble, of course, you shouldn't be doing the job in the first place. So, aside from the deep and profound arrogance of this gentleman, obviously he's asserting here that he had no problems with barristers. So I'll say a couple of things to that. Firstly, most of the court cases done over the years are very low profile court cases in the family court that have very serious consequences. And there's one case from Northern Ireland we know about in which he gave what was considered by the judge to be biased evidence, and it was overturned. Now, that family had the child taken away from them. So Lord only knows the damage that this guy has done over the years. Hopefully one day we'll be able to fully examine and investigate all of that, but in the meantime we need to obviously concentrate on the case of Lucy Letby. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, as I said, he's made this obviously very arrogant comment about him being the expert and not them, and them not knowing anything and I know everything, which is very indicative of his character, and we'll be going on to discuss that later on in this video. But his assertion that he dealt with barristers really easily and essentially ran rings around them and they didn't cause him any problems is completely inconsistent with what actually happened in court, where some of his cross-examination was an absolute train wreck. The reason that the prosecution won this case is because it was a deeply unfair process, as we know. This was not a fair trial in any meaningful sense of the word. It may be considered legally a fair trial, but as we're finding out, there are numerous trials that occur in the criminal justice system that are far from fair. Obviously, I'm sure people have seen that a major court case related to LIBOR rigging was overturned by the Supreme Court recently. I actually met Tom Hayes, who was the defendant in that case. I met him in London, and he was telling me, he'd been in prison for 6.5 years. He says 5.5 in newspaper articles, but I believe he was detained for a year before the court case, which is why it's 6.5. And, he told me about all the experience and all the problems with the court and all the problems the law had, and how the law can't deal with financial cases because they don't understand them. Exactly the same problems as medical cases and scientific cases. So the fact that you win, as Dr. Evans loves to celebrate, does not indicate that you dealt with the barristers well. It can just often mean that the court process was very much not a level playing field and very much a jaundiced process. But I'm just going to take the time to read out a little part of the cross-examination of Dr. Evans in court so that you can assess for yourselves whether he came out of this well and whether he ran rings around the barrister or not. So this is the part of the cross-examination of Dr. Evans for child G. Ben Mize is speaking with him at this point, Lucy's defence barrister. Projectile vomiting I'd like to ask you about next, Dr. Evans. Babies may vomit for many reasons, mightn't they? Yes. With more or less force? Yes. Forceful vomiting in a neonate can happen, can't it? I don't use the word, I'm not familiar with the term forceful vomiting. I'm not sure what it means. I'm not being awkward. It has no medical relevance. Sorry about that. A child that is unwell and is having an effect upon their stomach, a baby like this might projectile vomit. Do you agree? No. There's a division of opinion between you and Dr. Ventris on that, isn't there, Dr. Evans? I don't think so. You say with respect to her evidence, you don't agree with her evidence on this. I don't think Dr. Ventris said that babies will have projectile vomiting as a common side effect complication of an illness. I don't think she said that. Sorry, what I disagree with Dr. Ventris is she said infection caused the vomiting. I disagree. Yes, the infection occurred after the collapse. But you heard me put to her by reference to her statement where she said the projectile vomiting could be caused from infection. If she said that, fine, but I don't agree with her. I'm not being condescending, but she was a registrar at the time, and we've heard... I'm not going to criticise junior doctors for their opinion, okay? I'm not going to do that. I think it's unfair. So there, let's just analyse what's happened there. Firstly, you said, right, I'm definitely correct about this. Then Ben Miser said to him, I made a comment about forceful vomiting. So I could demonstrate that forceful vomiting is a frequently used term, but I won't. So he said, I don't know what that means, forceful vomiting. So then he settled on projectile vomiting. Then he's claimed Dr. Ventris didn't disagree with me. Then it's been demonstrated that Dr. Ventris did disagree with him, and then he said, well, she's just a registrar anyway, not like me, because he's that arrogant. And then he realises he might sound bad. He goes, I'm not going to criticise junior doctors for their opinion. I think it's unfair, although you've literally just done that. So that's just one part, but it goes on, so let's continue. Well, it is possible for baby G to have vomited very hard projectile vomiting because she was unwell. Do you agree or disagree with that? No, not that degree of vomiting, no. Pardon? Sorry, and if she had vomited because she was unwell, where would the 45 millilitres still in the stomach have come from? We can't actually say... Let's say that there was more than 45 millilitres in the stomach at the time of the vomit, that for whatever reason more milk had gone in there than should have been there for that one feed. We can't say how much extra there actually was, can we? We can say there was a fair bit. There was quite a lot, I would say. We don't know, do we? Yes, we do. There's no measurement of how much vomit there was, is there? No, but it's a lot of vomit. It's a lot of vomit, you know. So let's just analyse what's happened there. First of all, let's just go back so I'll make sure I get through all of this. So... Ben Miser has stated to Dr. Evans that it's perfectly possible for this infant to have projectile vomited, which is what Dr. Ventris has said, and what no doubt other doctors would said. And Dr. Evans has claimed, although no, that's not possible. And then Ben Miser said to him, well, Dr. Evans has made this comment about 45 millilitres still being in the stomach. Ben Myers has then outlined why we can't say that there's 45 millilitres, and then he's tried to go against that. He's tried to say, I know exactly how much is in there. And then he's conceded, we don't actually know how much is in there. And then he said, but it's a lot of vomit. It's a lot of vomit, you know. And then it continues. We don't know because we don't have an image of it, do we? No, but it's a lot of vomit. You don't know how much there was, Dr. Evans. There was quite a lot. 45 millilitres is not much more than this glass. So now he's just saying, so previously, if you go into the section where he's speaking with Nick Johnson, he tries to give a measurement of why he's come to this conclusion there was 45 millilitres. That measurement, I think most people would say that this is medically unsound. Everything that he's saying here is medically unsound. But what he also calculated and put into the court case is definitely mathematically unsound as well. So then he starts squirming and goes, 45 millilitres is not much more than this glass. You've got a vomit on the chair, you've got vomit on the canopy, and you've got 45 millilitres or more still left in the stomach. So now he's trying to claim it's more than 45 millilitres, even though he supposedly measured that it was 45 millilitres and wanted to say definitively that it was 45 millilitres. Just a minute ago, he was insistent, we know how much it was 45 millilitres. Now he's trying to say, actually there was more than 45 millilitres, even though during his interaction with Nick Johnson, he tried to give some kind of pathetic calculation indicating that he'd calculated there were 45 millilitres. So I'm not going to go on any further because it goes on like this for quite some time. But there are numerous instances like this in the court case where we see Dr. Evans being cross-examined and it doesn't go well for him at all. The problem with this court case was that Lucy Letby was set up to lose from the very start. And it was never a fair process, and the court was told a lot of things that are untrue and they're inaccurate, and it wasn't a fair process, and it was almost impossible for the prosecution not to win. if there had been a better defence for Lucy, they wouldn't have won. But it was nothing to do with the cross-examination of Dr. Evans, which at times was absolutely appalling. So this is probably the highlight of the interview, this next paragraph. This will leave you breathless, speechless, stultified, I have no doubt. What you have to be when giving evidence in any case is completely impartial and stay within your expertise. A number of doctors think they're there for the prosecution or for the defence. That's not your job. Let me tell the barrister your job is to give evidence on the scientific and medical matters that are complex, but that are within your experience and within your expertise, and within the books and research that exist. As long as you stick to that, you won't go wrong. Now, I really don't know what to say in response to this. You've just seen an example of Dr. Evans being completely impartial and sticking within his expertise. Obviously, I think most people that watch this video will be aware that he has consistently gone on about how he's won every case, etc., etc. I think people will also be aware that, indeed it's referenced earlier in this interview, that there's been this letter written by a previous trial judge to Judge James Goss, stating that he had a complete inability to give an objective and impartial opinion. That wasn't the first time. It's happened in Northern Ireland. It's happened in other cases. Now it's happening in the Lucy Letby case. So for him to actually say this, I don't know. I really don't know how to respond to this. I don't know how to read this. Is he just that much lacking in self-awareness that he genuinely believes that this is a fair point? Is he trying to... I don't know. I really cannot imagine what he's trying to do here. But for him to claim that he is completely impartial and that he has demonstrated that throughout his career, I just don't... Obviously, he needs to kind of give that impression publicly. But, it probably would have been better to do that when he was being interviewed by national newspapers, big national newspapers in England, in English, rather than, Radio Cymru in Welsh. Because no one's ever going to hear this. I mean, people are going to hear it now because I've translated it, but the audience for this programme must have been extremely small because there's not a large number of Welsh speakers in Wales. So, and it's, as I say, it's 6 o'clock on a Sunday evening on a radio station that no one listens to. So I shouldn't think a lot of people ever heard this, but this paragraph is just unbelievable. But we'll move on. Betty George, of course, you're familiar with politics as well. You went into politics when you were working in the Swansea Valley. You were a county councillor on the Old West Glamorgan Council. For the government, it was probably Labour at that time. Now, I should say before I go through this section, this will take a little while, but I do want to go through this because I think it's quite interesting insight into his character and who Dr. Evans is as a person. And I'm just going to respond to a claim that he makes at the end, which is not related to Lucy Letby, but I think is illustrative, so I hope people do find this useful. Well, yes, I think my legal work has been more fruitful and successful than my political work, but for one reason or another, when I came to live in the Swansea Valley, moved to the Valley, not working in the Valley at all, moved to a lovely house in Altwen, and the Welsh school Pontardaway, possibly, was down the road in the comprehensive school in East Aliaferra. Lord only knows what that is pronounced. Wasn't far away. So I didn't want the children, having to ride the bus every day. And the Swansea Valley, the Valley of Brotherhood, as Dafydd Rowlands called it, is a lovely place to tell the truth. And then, of course, I took an interest in school matters and became chair of governors and other such things. Then the Labour Party fell out with itself, the party split, and I thought this won't do. And I was the only Plaid Cymru Welsh Nationalist Party member on the West Glamorgan Council around the 1990s. And of course I got a lot of flack, of course, and of course the majority of them were Labour Party members. The sad thing about many of them, especially from Swansea, was that they were very anti-Welsh and they were dreadfully reactionary in the 1980s. So what you're really seeing here is the pattern of I was right and everyone else was wrong. But let's continue. There were protests about the need for more Welsh medium schools, and they were furious. They're all gone now, they won't come back. But of course on the council I was involved with education, so as a children's doctor that was of interest to me. Of course socially as well, it was quite important. And of course I was able to be in the local paper more or less after every meeting, so it was a bit of fun for me. And if I was challenged with something like, shouldn't you be in the hospital or doing your work instead of doing this, my response was always, I'm doing this because I don't do private work, you see, because it's better for me to do this here. And I think that was of benefit to the party because there was growth in support. And I believe because of that, Labour saw a threat. We got a new secondary school in the Swansea Valley. We got a more or less brand new building for the Welsh school, and also part of the traditional Cardiff College was transferred there. And I think we got those things because there's nothing better to challenge politicians than the threat of anger or another party. So it was a very interesting period. After that, I was on the Neathport Talbot Council, of course, because with the change in structure, the Swansea Valley became part of Neathport Talbot. And recently, you ran for the leadership of Plaid Cymru. Yes. Why did you go for that position? Why did you try? I think we haven't talked about the troubles Plaid Cymru has, but we'd be here all day, Betty. And it started with concerns about the party after a number of senior members of Plaid Cymru were thrown out of the party by the chair at that time. Following that, of course, some 40 members of the party across Wales left Plaid. They haven't returned. And with that split, we had a constituency where we had a good chance of winning, and that has disappeared, and that constituency is now safely in Labour's hands for a generation. And the same thing happened in Cardiff again, a big effort, although a lot of development happened, especially in West Cardiff. Well, for the party to have a place in the capital city, that's important. But this wasn't right, not acceptable to the chairmanship and people running Tygwyn 4, the party HQ. We were unhappy about that, and there was also disagreement in other parts of Wales. We accept if you disagree with the core policies, but this was on a personal level. So the thought came to run for the chairmanship. But after putting my name forward and then withdrawing it, the leadership then declared neutrality at first, then became fully supportive of the current chair. And of course, the only people who could vote were those who turned up to the conference in Swansea, about 800 of the membership in total. And I think all the members should get to choose who's in the chair. But I did a tour of all Wales. I made several small efforts to meet members across various counties. Now, one thing I'll say for this guy is he has got a good work ethic. I don't think anyone can deny that. So the planning is relevant in every party's politics, and it was an eye-opener because the same story was heard everywhere from the members of the party. No one was taking us seriously or listening. No one was replying to our letters. No one came here. No one knew what we felt or what the other issues were. And I believe that's true of all parties, and the feeling is that there's a place with the party and every party to connect much better with different sectors in health, agriculture, business, the labour movement. It's important these connections happen because through them, people then advocate for you. But if you're sitting in your little pen down in the Senedd, Welsh Parliament, and only sending a press release or two, that doesn't break through to the community at large. And I believe that's a weakness, and has been a weakness since the founding of the Senedd. Do we need more cross-party cooperation to solve issues in the health service, for example? Yes, I believe so. We could double the money going into the health service and we'd still be in the same position in 2 years' time if we don't change the way the money is distributed. I'm going to challenge and assess many of the assertions that Dr. Evans makes in the remainder of this issue, but I'm not going to challenge that assertion. I believe it's rather dubious that they could double the money going to the health service, but I'm not going to challenge that particular assertion. The saying goes, the penny's been spent. Have you discussed this with the parties, with Plaid Cymru, your own party? For the first time, actually, I got a phone call when I was over in Ireland last month following the Lucy Letby case. The Shadow Health Minister of the party called to say, let's meet up for a discussion on health matters, so there's something. Well, we come now to our final record. Before we hear it, what future is there for Wales and the Welsh language? Are you hopeful? Oh, I'm hopeful. I don't understand why so few people in Wales support freedom for our country, though the number is increasing, which is encouraging. There's nothing good for any country run like a colony, and I think a generation from now we will say the British decline continues. Our problem is this: to make Wales prosperous we must have independence. With independence and being part of the international democratic community and not dependent on the circus down in Westminster, we'd have the opportunity to take part in the world around us. A good example is energy. Wales could be completely self-sufficient in renewable energy. We have the seas, we have the water, wind and sun, of course. So there's plenty of opportunity to generate energy and export it. And of course, if you can generate energy, then you can develop the economy. And that's crucial because if the economy isn't strong, you lose your young Welsh people who go not just to England for work, but to Australia, New Zealand and other countries. But if the economy is strong, as has happened in Ireland, then you keep your best young people, and that will be the Wales of the future. And that's how, for example, to ensure the language, to ensure that our talented Welsh people stay in the country. Then there's some discussion of Beethoven. I'll just read the very last thing that he says. Beethoven's symphonies are so well known, and everyone knows the fifth, the sixth, but the ninth for me, because it brings in the choir, of course, and then to acknowledge the political message, that's the anthem of the European Union. And I don't understand why we're not part of the European Union. It shows, I believe, that this is our future as an independent country that's part of an international democratic movement. So what we see in this last part of the interview is the kind of development of Dewi Evans' political position. So he talks earlier on about the protests of the 1960s and 1970s, and I think not unreasonably he's concerned about the Welsh language and the Welsh culture being maintained, and I have sympathy with that view. So I'm going to actually assess briefly as I can, what he actually said in the last part of this interview. And the reason I'm going to do this is because usually when I'm going over stuff with Dr. Evans, we're dealing with a subject where he knows more than me, undeniably. For this particular section, we're dealing with something where I know more than him. So I would really like to... I found it fascinating to see him talking about a subject that he knows nothing about, very, very little, clearly. I know that for a fact because my understanding and knowledge is far greater than his. So when you actually see him talking, you see there is no diminishing in the confidence that he has in his own rightness, in the fact that he's correct. We see all these stories about him, everyone on the council was wrong apart from me, and then I did this and then I did that, and Wales should do this and Wales should do that because I believe this. So I do think it's worthwhile just for 5 minutes for me to just explain why he's wrong about some of these issues. So the central contention of Dr. Evans is that Wales should become independent and it would become more prosperous, and that a central facet of this should be generating energy and exporting it. Let's not dwell too much on this comment about people moving to England for work, given that Dr. Evans has spent most of his post-paediatrics career travelling to this country that he feels so hostile towards in order to work. But let's not dwell on that too much. He goes on here about, in order to make Wales prosperous, we must have independence. With independence and being part of the international democratic community and not dependent on the circus down in Westminster, we'd have the opportunity to take part in the world around us. So before I begin discussing this, I want to say 2 things. Firstly, I'm not hostile to the idea of Welsh independence. I don't consider it to be independence. I consider it to be a form of devolution. Maybe it's more autonomy. Any kind of independence is a fantasy nowadays for any country, let alone the country the size of Wales. Wales will always be dependent on the international community in some form or another. Same for Scotland. Same frankly for the United Kingdom, or indeed any country. But obviously the smaller the country is, the more that this applies. So I don't even think the term independence is accurate. But if people vote for it in Scotland, if people vote for it in Wales, I'm in favour of it, absolutely. And I'm not a defender of the Westminster government, and I've said previously in previous videos, I'm perfectly happy to leave England tomorrow. I've had enough of living here. I've been living here a long time. I'm pretty much sick of it now, and I do intend to emigrate in the coming years. I don't know if I can emigrate while my dog's here because it'll be difficult in some respects, but I do intend to leave the country at some point. So I don't want people to think I'm hostile towards Wales or Welsh independence, or that I'm a big fan of the Westminster government, because nothing could be further from the truth before we go any further. So the first thing is that the UK government already gives Wales £18 billion every year, and this will increase to £22.4 billion between 2026 and 2029. Obviously, that's an enormous amount of money. So let me put that into... I should say as well that they receive other payments as well. That's not all. The 22 billion is not all the subsidies that they receive. For example, there's money for rail enhancements here, and there's other stuff that is handed over. But let's just deal with the raw 22 billion for the sake of argument. So the current GDP of Wales is 92 billion pounds. So this 22 billion pounds is nearly a quarter of the GDP of the country. So that would just be gone overnight if Wales is independent. Now, I'm sure you can see that would be very significant for the economy. But let's move on, because we'll revisit that later on. So Dr. Evans obviously makes this comment about Wales being completely self-sufficient in renewable energy because they have the seas, the water, the wind and the sun. So I found this article that says the entire Welsh energy industry, they're already a big exporter of energy now, by the way, but the entire Welsh energy industry is worth £4.8 billion. So even if they doubled that, it would still be less than a quarter of the £22 billion that's going to disappear. But I'll revisit these figures in more detail later on. Renewable energy is already generating a lot of Wales' energy consumption. but they actually have a plan to be completely reliant on renewables by 2035, but they're only actually meeting a quarter of that demand at the moment, let alone are they going to generate additional energy and then export that as well. And they're already a big exporter of energy as it stands now. So I've just taken this statement here from an article. Wales remains a net exporter of electricity, generating over twice as much electricity as it consumes on an annual basis. But now it wants to fourfold increase the amount of renewable energy that it produces in 9 years. But Dr. Evans thinks they're going to do, well, he doesn't know this obviously, but he thinks they're going to do that and export energy, and that's going to lead to Welsh economic independence. So let's move on. Not only would they lose £22 billion that we've already discussed, nearly a quarter of their GDP, but also they don't have any of the infrastructure that you'd associate with an independent country. So this would require a significant amount of expenditure. So firstly, they don't have any arrangement for borders of immigration. They don't have any security arrangements, and they don't have significant military at this point in time. They don't have intelligence services. They're not a member of NATO, and they don't have... They'd almost certainly have to join NATO, but Wales in NATO would be such a small entity that would be a very difficult negotiation for them, to say the least. Wales does not issue its own passport. Wales is not represented at the United Nations and other international bodies. Wales doesn't have any international treaties or relations with other countries. Wales doesn't have any trade deals in place. Wales, of course, doesn't have its own currency. It'd have to join the euro, and we know anecdotally that as soon as a country joins the euro, prices of things tend to go up. That's been a big problem with me moving to Croatia, is that they joined the euro, all the house prices went up massively almost immediately. Wales doesn't control its monetary policy. Now, this isn't necessarily a massive problem because I don't necessarily agree with the Bank of England controlling monetary policy in England. However, it would be a kind of logistical issue that the country would have to deal with. Wales doesn't have its own central bank, so other small countries such as Croatia do have a central bank. This is the Croatian central bank on the screen. Dr. Evans has also cited Ireland, and I'll just mention briefly the banking industry in Ireland is very much mature than the banking industry in Wales. There's no infrastructure to collect taxes in Wales at this point in time, although certainly the full infrastructure doesn't exist. There's no social security system in Wales, or there isn't an independent social security system. As far as I'm aware, all national broadcast media in Wales is provided externally. As I mentioned, Dr. Evans made these comments about Ireland, but Ireland received €40 billion from the EU between, I believe, 1973 and 2018. Now, that's an enormous amount of money over that period of time, but even if you take inflation into account, Wales would need a hell of a lot more than 40 billion to plug the gap that they've got. So even if they did join the EU, which is likely, and even if they did manage to negotiate a good deal with the EU, which would be challenging, the EU is not going to give Wales £22 billion a year, or it would be extremely unlikely. I should mention as well that there was a massive banking crisis in Ireland, seeing as he's citing the fact that the island economy is really strong. Numerous banks collapsed, and in fact, as we know, this was a contagion that spread across Europe, and there was rioting and all kinds of problems. So to say that all these economies are always strong is simply not true. So if Ireland did join the EU, this is approximately the GDP of countries in US dollars listed in order from top to bottom. So Wales would be roughly around here. They'd be around Ethiopia, Angola, Venezuela, Guatemala, and Bulgaria, small Eastern European country. That is roughly where they belong. Unless they massively increase their economy, which is very unlikely. Obviously, a lot of money is going to be taken out of their economy. And that could have investment consequences as well. So if you compare that to the biggest countries in the European Union, the German economy is literally over 40 times bigger than the Welsh economy. And that also would apply to the English economy, the French economy, and the Italian economy. It must be said that even though, let's say, Wales did become independent, England would then be an independent country as well. Even though England has obviously exited the European Union and a Brexit has occurred, I would still say England would have a considerably bigger influence over the European Union than Wales. Wales would be a tiny, tiny fish in this enormous pool, essentially. And presenting this as complete independence, I think is, to say the least, naive. And I don't want to go over this in depth, but there are all kinds of poverty and infrastructure issues for Wales as well that are well documented that would cause further issues. As I mentioned previously, Wales already has a massive fiscal deficit, so it has reduced that slightly in percentage terms, but you're talking about tens of billions of pounds. And then on top of that, as I mentioned, Wales already has a plan to reach this target of 100% renewable electricity. That already requires them to quadruple the level of energy generation in a relatively short period of time. And this is described here as daunting, considering that there was zero new wind capacity added in 2023. I'll just very briefly mention as well that Dr. Evans cited solar energy, cited the sun. I'm not sure if you've noticed if you're walking around in Britain, but we generate very little solar energy in this country for really obvious reasons. And Wales is one of the rainiest regions in the United Kingdom. In fact, Snowdonia is literally the rainiest region of the country. Britain only generates 4% of its energy through solar power, so the idea of increasing revenue via solar energy is completely flawed. So finally, I'm just going to go over these two documents quickly. So this is all completely obvious anyway, but if Wales became fully independent and lost the approximately 18 billion fiscal transfer it currently receives from the UK government each year, the consequences for the Welsh economy would be significant and challenging. So Wales currently spends far more on public services than it raises in revenue. According to UK government figures, this deficit is around 22 to 25% of GDP, one of the highest in Europe. This gap is so there's annual fiscal deficit of 18 to 22 billion pounds because public spending is enormous. It's an enormous gap between tax revenue and public spending. This gap is currently filled by fiscal transfers from Westminster. So the consequences of losing UK fiscal support would be increased borrowing, austerity, declining public services, increased taxes, and then there's some stuff about currency and monetary policy. It's likely the standard of living would initially decline, higher taxes, lower public spending, or both, potential capital flight and business uncertainty, currency or inflation issues if monetary stability is lacking. And then I finally asked this question about if Wales became an independent country, how much additional revenue above and beyond what it earns now do you think the country could realistically generate by selling energy overseas while also quadrupling its use of renewables to meet government targets for 2035? Would it in fact be challenging to sell any extra energy at all? And then there's a lot of information that has been estimated here. And at the end it says, by 2035, assuming independence and full control over energy exports, an optimistic scenario would be additional revenue 3.5 billion, a realistic scenario would be 1 to 1.5 billion, and a pessimistic would be 500 million. So if we take the realistic scenario, they would need to find another, it's going to be more than 20 to 21 billion pounds because of inflation and because the deficit's likely to get bigger. So you could be looking at the need to find 30 billion pounds on top of this. So according to Dr. Evans, by selling the energy overseas, they would achieve economic independence, but in fact, it would only plug about between 3 and 5% of the deficit that they're going to lose from losing £22 billion a year from Westminster. Now, the reason I've taken 10 minutes to go over that is because when I was reading through it, I knew how wrong he was because I know a fair bit about economics. I'm certainly not an expert, but I've written quite a few books about finance and economics, and I know a lot of people that work in finance and analysts and all kinds of different people, and I've taken an interest in it because money makes the world go round, and I wanted to understand how it works. So I have a reasonable grounding in economics. So what I just provided, that was very, very much easier for me to deal with than I'm doing all these medical things that I really don't know the first thing about. That is very, very much more challenging for me to deal with because I don't have the knowledge, I don't have the experience, and it's highly complex and it's quite impenetrable, I think. And also, plus, at least with economics and finance, you deal with money on a daily basis, so it's a bit more normal in terms in our lives. Whereas, stenotrophomonas multifida is not something that I'd ever previously considered. For example, I never thought about necrotizing enterocolitis or any of these other things. So I'm having to learn about them, and it's very difficult. But as I was reading the comments of Dr. Evans with regard to Wales, its independence and how it could achieve independence and be more prosperous, I just knew that it was all fundamentally incorrect, and that's because I've got a lot more knowledge than him on this topic. And I didn't intrinsically know that, but I knew that from reading his words, because what I just went through it's economics 101. I mean, it's not, someone that's more knowledgeable than me would be able to tear it to shreds even more, but really his views are so naive as to be utterly stupid. And as I was kind of reading that, I reflected on the fact that, and I've kind of mentioned this before, but a person that has a little amount of knowledge and a certain degree of intelligence, like a reasonable level of intelligence, maybe a little bit above average, but then they're given power or they're given a position of influence, and they start to believe that they're right about everything, is a very dangerous person. And it's clear that this gentleman, when he's talking about paediatrics, when he's talking about child health, when he's talking about medical matters, we know from the words of more esteemed doctors and the work of people that are more qualified than him, that his work in that area is pretty flawed at times, and he's put a lot of science into this court case that is extremely flawed. But you notice that when he's talking about a topic that he knows literally nothing about, it doesn't make him any less confident. Like he doesn't think, right, well, I don't actually know anything about economics. I don't really know that much about politics. I'll just start talking about these things as if I know what I'm talking about because I'm Dr. Evans. When in actual fact, he hasn't got the first clue. And as I say, I don't want to bash Wales as a country, and I don't want to bash the idea of Welsh independence, because broadly speaking, I support independence for countries, and if people want to be more autonomous, that's entirely natural. And I'm not a fan of the Westminster government, and I even understand his hostility towards the Westminster government. But what he said in that interview is utterly ludicrous. And I've tried to find, obviously there are organisations that believe Wales can become independent economically. I've tried to find, there's some reports. I did find a report that was reported on the BBC website in 2024, and even this report admits that in the short to medium term it would be very challenging, and that there'd probably be austerity, there'd probably be higher taxes, there'd probably be reduced public services, let alone would Wales become more prosperous in the short to medium term. There's just no way. When you're being subsidised, I mean, subsidies happen all over the world in a variety of different ways, but when you're receiving a subsidy that's 25% of your GDP, that means you'd have to grow your economy overnight by 25% of your GDP just to tread water. That's just not going to happen. So there'd be very serious. That's even if they didn't have to spend any extra money. But I've just given you a massive list of things that Wales doesn't have currently, like such as control over its own borders. That would be a massive challenge immediately. That's just one of the many, many things that I listed. So, of course, this half-wit who goes into court cases saying, I reckon she injected air into its stomach. Oh, no, she did this. Oh, no, someone just said that in court, so I'll change my mind to this. Oh, it happened on the 22nd of June. Oh, no, wait a minute, she's not on duty. Oh, now it's the 23rd of June. This is a deeply arrogant man, essentially. I mean, I think he has strong qualities of narcissism. Whether he would actually be medically considered a narcissist, I don't know. But he's someone who has a very high regard for his own opinion, who always believes that he's right, and so thinks he can just give it. He thinks, and I think a lot of it comes from court. This is my view of the legal system. This is my observation. So a lot of the legal system is about, you try to get together some evidence. Sometimes you have strong evidence, sometimes you have weaker evidence, but then you just build a case around the evidence. So a lot of the time, the barristers just go into court and they just say, we say that this is the case, or we say that we believe this, or we say that that the jury should accept this line of argument. It's literally, and we saw this with Nick Johnson, and we're going to see a lot more of it in the weeks and months to come. He will just literally walk into a courtroom and just say stuff, and that's what it is. And then the defence will probably do the same thing as well. In this case, the defence is trying to use legitimate arguments, but quite often the defence is defending someone guilty who's definitely guilty, so they have to just come up with stuff. So then they're the ones just saying stuff and trying to convince the jury. And that's really the basis of the court system. And of course, Dr. Evans has undoubtedly flourished within the court system because he is just willing to go in there and do exactly what I've just described. He will just say stuff. He will say, there's 45 millilitres of milk. Well, we don't know there is. Yes, we do. No, we don't. Okay, we don't. But there's actually more than 45 millilitres. That's what he's willing to do. He's willing to say anything. And because he's had success, but undeniably, as he celebrates and proclaims himself, he's actually won a lot of cases, won the vast majority of cases. So he sees that it works in the courtroom. In a courtroom, you just walk in and go, oh, well, I reckon, if Wales went into... you can just make these off-the-cuff arguments. But in the actual real world, things actually have to make sense. So in the real world, the explanations that he's given in the Lucy Letby case, they don't actually work out when you look at what actually happened on the unit. They work in a court case where you don't have to be correct. You just have to be convincing. In the real world, the arguments that he's making about Wales and its independence would not work out. It would be an absolute calamity, in my opinion, for Wales to be independent. And I don't get any pleasure from saying that, because I'm sure that the country has been screwed over to a certain extent over the years by the Westminster government. He's probably absolutely right about that, but he's absolutely wrong that it could achieve financial independence and prosperity by selling its energy overseas. Complete bullshit. And I knew that immediately as soon as I read it. I didn't know that I would take time to demonstrate this. But I think that's a very illustrative point about his character that I really wanted to take the time to demonstrate. And I hope that it's not too indulgent. And I hope people think that I'm not bashing Wales, because I like Wales. I've been to Wales on holiday, and it's a beautiful country, and I love walking in the hills. But if I lived in Wales and I was Welsh and I had a vote on whether or not to go independent, I would definitely vote against it. I'm not sure about in Scotland. Scotland would face massive challenges as well. And I support a vote. I support, if they want to have a referendum in Wales on independence, I fully support it. And if people want to vote for it, then good luck. Hope things go well for you. But if I lived in Wales and I was Welsh, I would vote against it for the reasons that I outlined. And I just wanted to take a little bit of time to demonstrate that and to illustrate, this guy will just literally just say things because he believes them, and he believes that when he believes them that he's automatically correct, even if he knows very little or indeed almost nothing about the actual subject. So that was slightly less painful for me going over this interview than I thought it was going to be. There were definitely some very painful moments, but it was nice to find this new material and hopefully uncover some things that people have found interesting, both about the Lucy Letby case and about Dr. Dewi Evans. Finally, I just wanted to mention that I asked people to like the previous video, and you were really supportive, and this got 248 likes from 1.9k views, so that's approximately 13%, which is a really high percentage. So if you have enjoyed this video, if you could like it, it really helps. YouTube occasionally shows videos to less people for no apparent reason. You don't have any control over this. It's been doing this a little bit recently, but because I've got so many loyal viewers, the views have held up really well. But liking videos definitely helps. So if you could like this video as much as possible, then it would really be appreciated. And again, had an incredible number of subscribers. As you can see, it's got up 465 in the last 28 days, but if you're not subscribed to the channel, if you could help by subscribing, it helps me, helps make the videos more visible. It's just a good thing for the algorithm. So it's very much appreciated for everyone that does subscribe. So if you've enjoyed this video and you're not subscribed, again, if you could do that, it would be really appreciated. Apart from that, if you have any queries, comments, observations, etc., then I'd really love to hear them. I always enjoy reading the comments, and I'll look forward to reading them for this video.